good afternoon to everyone, both here in the room with us and online. And welcome to the first panel of today's conference, which is on the topic of towards gender equality in unpaid care work. My name is Karina Arabagieva, and I'm a researcher here at the ETY, and I work on the topic of gender equality, work-life balance, and unpaid care work from a legal perspective. And I'm very happy to have the chance to discuss this important topic with four very impressive speakers who have extensive experience and expertise on gender equality issues. And so we have online Barbara Helferich and Carolina Vidal, who maybe has not yet connected online, and Paula Franklin and Paola Panzeri here with me in the room. And I would like to tell you more about these speakers in a minute, but first I would like to say a few words on the topic of today's panel. No, actually, first I will say something about interpretation. So we have interpretation today in French, English, and Spanish. So for those of you who are online, I think you can change. There's an icon of an interpretation in the Zoom window. And for those of you who are in the room, there is a sort of device like this and headphones in the back of the room. So one of the presentations will be in Spanish, so maybe you might want to use it for that channel. 1 is French, 2 is English, and 3 is Spanish, in case you might want to take advantage of that. Okay, so back to the topic of the panel. I'm sure it's not a surprise to any of you here that women in general continue to perform a greater share, and often a much greater share, of unpaid care work than men. And what I mean by this is a care for children and other adults, as well as domestic tasks such as cooking and cleaning, performed without remuneration and generally in the private home. And data from a few years ago suggests that across the EU, women spend about 1.5 times the amount of time per day as men on unpaid care work. So that's about 3.9 hours per day, as opposed to 2.6 hours per day, where in some member states this is much, much higher. So in some member states, women spend double the amount of time or more on unpaid care work. And what does this mean? So the fact that women have this greater burden of unpaid care work means that they are more likely to choose not to participate in the labor market at all, to choose to participate in the labor market on a part-time basis or on temporary and precarious contracts, leading to job insecurity as well as lower earnings, and which also means lower economic independence. And care responsibilities may mean that may affect women's choice of career, their career progression, and career opportunities in general. And I am sure that these speakers will elaborate on this today. And so this inequality between men and women is really at the heart of many other dimensions of gender inequality. It is a long-standing issue that is really deeply rooted in our societies and which strongly influences women's lives and careers. And even though European societies and economies have in general moved away from the so-called male breadwinner and female housewife model, gender stereotypes regarding women's sort of role in the home and in care continue to be very present. And I should mention here also, of course, that women constitute an overwhelming majority of paid care and domestic workers, whose labor is often undervalued and poorly remunerated. And none of this is anything new, but the COVID pandemic really brought these issues to the fore. And alongside other issues, of course, disproportionately affecting women, such as domestic violence and so on. And the amount of unpaid care work increased massively during the pandemic due to school closures, among other things. Sometimes, and women continue to take a greater share of this, sometimes leading to reduction of working hours, taking paid or unpaid leave, or even dropping out of the labor market. And although it should also be mentioned that on the more positive side, there is evidence showing that men became more engaged in some aspect of care work, such as childcare in particular. And in general, I think, and I think this is important, the pandemic has reminded us of the absolutely fundamental importance of both paid and unpaid care work for the functioning and for the resilience of our societies. And it has also acted as a catalyst for the proliferation of certain types of working arrangements, such as home-based telework, on which we will discuss later, which, at least in theory, offer possibilities for some workers to better combine personal and professional life. And so I think that now is really a crucial time to be thinking about and advocating for transformative policies that take us further towards equality in unpaid care work between men and women. We have, of course, the EU Work-Life Balance Directive, which is due to be implemented by member states this year, but we really need much more than this. And I hope that we can discuss some of the key action points here today. And so without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Barbara Helferich. Barbara is an independent consultant in the sphere of gender equality, EU social and environmental policies, with more than 25 years of experience in EU policymaking. And she's one of the co-founders of the feminist think tank Gender 5+, and has worked in leading positions in the European Commission and NGOs, including as the first Secretary General of the European Women's Lobby. Barbara has also been the senior expert for the European trade unions on work-life balance, on working conditions and violence and harassment at work. And more recently, she has worked and published on issues of the care economy and gender-sensitive public procurement, and has served as an advisor for the Council of Europe, the ILO, and the European Institute for Gender Equality. So we are extremely happy to have her here to speak on the topic of gender equality and unpaid care work. Thank you very much, Barbara, and the floor is yours. You have around 15 minutes. I think you're still muted. Ah, there.
So can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes. Yes, perfect.
Is the PowerPoint on the screen?
Yes.
It is, okay.
Or maybe you need to, you need to start. Perfect, perfect. Thank you very much.
So again, thank you very much. I have, I believe, 15 minutes to address the issue of unpaid care work. And I'm extremely happy to be that you invited me to this very interesting panel. I want to start with what constitutes the care crisis, and then I want to discuss a bit what is the gender dimension. We all know care is predominantly done, unpaid care is predominantly done by women. And then I have a sort of a catalog of suggestions of to move forward and make unpaid care work and care work a central concern of the economy and social policies in general. So I hope the 15 minutes will be enough. So the care crisis, and we talk about the care crisis mainly in the context of the COVID pandemic, but the care crisis obviously was has its root long before the pandemic, and the issues were predominantly the privatization and the dismantling of the welfare state, which we've seen in particular since 2008, but also before, and also in the northern countries, which have been more socially oriented in terms of care policies. But privatization and dismantling is happening everywhere and across Europe. The second pillar of the care crisis is the aging population. We all know, particularly in Europe, we have a rapidly aging population, and making this an urgent issue for policymakers to address the care of elderly people now and in the future. We also know there's a chronic lack of care in capitalist societies, and we also talk about changing family structures. And here in particular, we see a resurgence of single-headed female households performing unpaid care work and being under particular stresses in terms of also working time and combining care and combining family care work and work. And then the care crisis is also manifested in the persistent and at times reinforced patriarchal division of labor. We're talking about a segregation of the labor market, where care is female and better paid positions are male. We're also talking about the way working time is arranged, not taking account of the needs that a family may have in terms of care provisions. Policy responses to the care crisis and generally, and I'm really making very general sweeping statements here, but I believe they ring a bell of truth. In general, we see that there is an underestimation of the overall impact of the care crisis, locally, nationally, and globally. And I'm saying that because when I look at policy responses, for example, to the COVID pandemic and the care crisis which were happening in the hospitals and the elderly homes, it wasn't really addressed, and we all know that, and it has not been responded to the extent that the crisis has manifested itself during the pandemic. Policy responses also fail to include and consult and work with
Barbara, I'm very, very sorry to interrupt you, but the interpreters are saying that there is a problem with the sound.
Okay.
There's a little bit of background noise. Maybe the microphone is too close to you, or I'm not really sure. Let's try like this.
Would that work?
I think maybe it sounds a bit better.
Yeah, it was too close to the face, I think.
Yes, okay. I think hopefully this is better. Thank you very much.
Okay, so sorry
to interrupt. Sorry.
It's an old headphone.
No worries.
So policy responses fail to include and consult with trade unions in particular, and that of course means that the concerns of women working in care work and also women who try to combine unpaid care work and paid care work, their needs and issues are not fully taken into consideration. Policy responses are also breathtakingly, I say, gender blind, despite the obvious. The issue of gender equality and care is hardly being touched upon in policy instruments that we have seen over the last years that address care issues. Oftentimes, policy responses are singular. They address only a specific aspect of the problem and do not take a holistic approach. And then we see investments and budgets being cut around care. And that, of course, means that women or people at home caring do not have as much opportunity to access public care homes or crash facilities. And then policy responses also continue to treat care work principally as a private issue, again, a feminized issue where care is considered to be part of the private life and is not really addressed in fully by the public services. And then I could continue. So all I'm saying is, of course, more to say about the way policies have responded to the care crisis. Quickly, an example, I've been looking at the EU gender equality strategy on care. It does remain at the level of care provisions. It does not address the structural problems that are quite obvious, be it gender inequalities, or be it the structure of working time. It does not address structural inequalities expressed also in those issues I just mentioned. It does not include the use of macroeconomic instruments at European level to help place care at the center of economic activity and decision making. So while there is an attempt to address care from a European perspective, it does remain very singular and does not address the real issues we're talking about. And I'm repeating what you just said before, just to make the point. Women spend about 4.25 hours per day on average on unpaid work, and men spend about 1.23 hours on unpaid work average daily. And then 70%, and now even more, of healthcare workers are women globally. So there is no way around it. It is really a very, very gendered issue. So unpaid care work and the economy, gender inequality, and I'm reading this because I think this is an important issue. Gender inequality in unpaid care work is the missing link in the analysis of gender gaps, such as employment patterns, wages, and job quality. So that means that much more investigation needs to be done in relation in the relationship between gender equality, inequality, and unpaid care, and the analysis needs to be deepened in a much more structured and deep way. And we all have been talking about this for many, many years, that tackling entrenched gender norms and stereotypes is and must be a first step in redistributing responsibilities for care and housework between women and men. And I'm not only saying redistributing, but redistributing equally responsibilities between men and women on care. So the core of my argument here, and there are many other feminists who agree and who have contributed to this debate, care needs to be a central activity for well-being. Care is has become an issue that is of central importance economically and socially, and so some basic approaches to address unpaid care work is to recognize the economic contribution of unpaid care work. It's what I said before, it's redistributing care work between women and men, unpaid care work between women and men, and redistribute care responsibilities more equally between family and the state, and tackle the entrenched social norms and gender stereotypes. So on that basis, there are a number of policies and policy tools and mechanisms that can contribute to the recognition, to the redistribution, and to the tackling of entrenched gender stereotypes and social norms. And here's a list of about 10 measures that I think are important if we design a policy around the care crisis and unpaid care work. And the first point here, and looking at Europe in particular, and like the European semester, is the use of macroeconomic tools and mechanisms to put care at the center of economic activities. So that's a political choice. That is something that the heads of states may need to address in a very structural way. The second point is to measure unpaid work using, for example, time budget surveys. And that can be done in terms of household surveys, embedding time use modules within those surveys. And that is an important measure to get an understanding of what is really happening in terms of providing unpaid care work and the impact it has on those who are performing unpaid care work, in particular the impact on women. And my third point is to develop specific indicators to measure unpaid work, its provision and the impact on well-being, welfare, and of course, gender equality, which should be a central concern when addressing unpaid care work. The fourth point, and a lot of work done by FEPS on this, establish care checks and care monitoring mechanisms to be included in the procedures for social and economic impact assessments. And those are the impact assessments we're talking about before any legislation is being submitted. It's not only a budgetary thing, how much does it cost, but actually, how does it impact on care provisions and care facilities? And in terms of alleviating the burden on women on performing unpaid work, it is necessary to improve access to public services, childcare, and care for the elderly. Investment is another issue. It needs to be gender proven, investment in gender proven public infrastructures, and we're talking about creches, care facilities, etc. What is also important, and here Europe falls short, like many other all the member states, is ensure equal amounts of maternity and paternity leave. I leave it like this for the moment. There's lots to say about it, and there are lots of issues or specific issues that need to be addressed, but we need to aim for an equal distribution of paternity and maternity leave. Gender budgeting is something that has been called for by numerous actors, and gender budgeting across national budget and particularly also the European budget. And what has been a concern for a long time is the redesigning of tax frameworks, and many tax frameworks tend to discriminate second earners and leaving them with a heavier tax than the first earner. And here again, it is a very gendered issue because normally, or in many cases, it is women who earn less in the family context than the men. Train and educate family carers and acknowledge the value of their work and its relevance for gender equality. Also a big thing. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to go into that. And obviously, if we want to address more structurally the issue of unpaid care work, we need to look at reducing overall working time and ensuring greater flexibility at work. The issue of a new care deal has been around. To summarize, it is what we call a holistic approach to care. And what I'm saying is care policies from this perspective, from a more holistic perspective, should be measured along 3 axes. Do they actually, those policies that are being proposed, value care evidenced in particular by the amount of pay and the quality of the working condition? To what extent do these policies addressing unpaid and paid care work, to what extent do they promote gender equality? Are they promoting gender equality at all? And do they make use of financial and macroeconomic instruments to support care as essential and central social and economic activities? So these questions need to be at the background when designing a policy that looks at a more holistic use of care. So to finish up, what is needed is a shift in general, structurally, from a GDP-driven policy to a more people-centered, care-focused economic approach. And that will also address the issues of unpaid care. And the existing models of care, especially if you look at old age homes and the carers and women caring at home for their parents and family members, and these models are rapidly becoming unsustainable. They are already unsustainable, and they're violating both the rights of those who care and those who are cared for. And I thank you very much, and I finish here.
Thank you very much, Barbara. This was really an excellent presentation, and I really like also the note in which you finished. It is time to move away from this focus on growth to a people-centered, well-being economy. And I think that's really important. And I think it's time that we realize that we need to make a bigger effort to really recognize the value of care work. And I also thought what you said was really important because, of course, what I talked about in my introduction was the equal sharing of care work between men and women. But I thought what you said about the sharing of responsibility between the family and the state was also really, really important as well. So thank you very much again. I will move on to our next speaker fairly quickly. I think Carolina, is she connected? Great. So our next speaker, I'm very happy to welcome Carolina Vidal, who is the Confederal Secretary for Women, Equality and Working Conditions of Comisiones Obreras, or Workers' Commissions, which is the largest trade union in Spain. Carolina is a practicing labor lawyer and worked at the legal service of Comisiones Obreras before she joined the executive in 2017, working initially in the areas of trade union action and training. And she has significant experience as an advisor and negotiator of collective disputes and collective bargaining, including in areas related to gender equality. I'm very, very fortunate to have her here online today to provide a trade union perspective and tell us about the position and activities of Comisiones Obreras and some interesting developments in Spain in this context. And so Carolina will speak in Spanish. So for those of you, I think online it's a bit easier. For those of you in the room, if you would like to listen to her intervention in English or French, then it's channel 1 for French and channel 2 for English. Thank you very much, Karina, for being here with us. The floor is yours for around 15 minutes.
Buenos días, un saludo fraternal desde España, un saludo de las comisiones obreras, de la Ejecutiva Confederal y especialmente de la Secretaría de Mujeres, Igualdad y Condiciones de Trabajo. Es verdad, en primer lugar, dar la enhorabuena a la interviniente anterior por la magnífica exposición. Y desde las comisiones obreras estamos trabajando desde hace ya tiempo en mantener una estrategia confederal para todo el Estado español sobre los cuidados. El trabajo de los cuidados hemos aprendido tras la pandemia que es esencial para el cuidado de la vida y por tanto esencial para el cuidado de la sociedad. Esto supone que además de que los cuidados tienen una vertiente claramente individual para las personas usuarias que tienen que ser cuidadas, sean discapacitados, sean dependientes, sean menores, etcétera, también tiene una vertiente claramente social y colectiva, y es que necesitamos tener una estrategia estatal y entendemos también que una estrategia europea en la que sabemos que se está trabajando para entender de forma transversal y de forma estructural los cuidados como un servicio público, desde la política pública para poder cuidar. Entendemos que esta vertiente colectiva y social de las tareas de los cuidados, entendidas como una necesidad política que tienen que prestar y atender los gobiernos, tendremos que estudiar cómo es indispensable para entender cuál es la consecuencia de que el trabajo de cuidar haya recaído históricamente sobre las mujeres. Entendemos que cuando hablamos de los cuidados, por tanto, no podemos entender que solo es un derecho social desde el punto de vista de la persona cuidada, sino que entendemos que tenemos que, en esta estrategia general, estatal, europea, en el contexto que sea de cuidados, hacer alusión también y tener en cuenta de manera equilibrada las condiciones, en nuestra opinión, laborales de las personas que cuidan, que son mayoritariamente mujeres. ¿Por qué? Entendemos que la división sexual del trabajo que históricamente se ha realizado, las personas que cuidan, mujeres dentro de los hogares, dentro de las familias, y el trabajo que la sociedad económica, política, ideológicamente se ha entendido como productivo fuera del trabajo de los cuidados y fuera del trabajo de las familias. Por eso los hombres están fuera cuidando. Fuera no cuidando, sino produciendo, quería decir. Esto viene a suponer que se entiende que sociológicamente las tareas de los cuidados tienen que estar realizadas por las mujeres, porque a modo de, entre comillas, ángel de la guarda, nosotras somos las que sabemos cómo hay que cuidar y ese es el trabajo que debemos desarrollar. Por ese motivo, entre otras cosas, no se ha dado nunca valor, y atendemos a esta palabra de forma especial, valor, ni económico, ni político, ni social, al trabajo de los cuidados que hemos venido realizando las mujeres. Por eso al Estado español lo que le estamos proponiendo al Gobierno de España es una estrategia de cuidados donde desde el Gobierno se propongan medidas de carácter público que, uno, saquen los cuidados del trabajo familiar, saquen los cuidados o que están ocultos en las familias y que realizan las mujeres, por tanto, profesionalizándolos y, por tanto, dándoles valor económico. porque además a las mujeres en su desarrollo profesional les ha lastrado profundamente el hecho de que hayan hecho y hemos venido haciendo y hacemos esa doble jornada de los cuidados, que hace que además hayamos precarizado profundamente nuestras relaciones laborales. ¿Por qué? Porque las mujeres en este país, en España, utilizamos el trabajo a tiempo parcial como medida de conciliación, como medida de corresponsabilidad para poder atender a los dependientes, a los menores, etc. 7 de cada 10 mujeres que tienen una jornada de trabajo reducida la tienen sin querer tenerla, pero no tienen más remedio porque tienen que compatibilizar su trabajo laboral, su trabajo profesional, con el trabajo interno y oculto de los cuidados. Por otro lado, el trabajo de los cuidados tiene una incidencia clara en la brecha salarial. ¿Por qué? Porque a menudo se negocian complementos salariales a los que las mujeres no podemos optar porque son incompatibles con la doble jornada y con la doble presencia. Por ejemplo, complementos salariales que premian la turnicidad, que premian la nocturnidad, que premian la disponibilidad en el centro de trabajo, afectan profundamente a la composición salarial de las mujeres, del trabajo y, por tanto, de los salarios mensuales de las mujeres. Por otro lado, los cuidados lastran profundamente hacia un concepto en España denominado mujeres inactivas que nos preocupa profundamente. Son todas esas mujeres que no figuran en la lista del desempleo, que no figuran tampoco como paradas, que no figuran en las mujeres que trabajan, sino que forman parte de unas estadísticas desconocidas, que son las mujeres que han abandonado su carrera profesional, que no optan ni siquiera a un puesto de trabajo porque tienen que cuidar. En este país, en España, este porcentaje se incrementa de forma desgarradora para los casos de mujeres que tienen 2 o más de 2 hijos. Con menos de 2 hijos, las mujeres inactivas tienen un porcentaje de la mitad de las mujeres que están inactivas cuando tienen más de 3 hijos. Por otro lado, cuidar al mismo tiempo de forma no profesionalizada afecta claramente a la salud de las mujeres. Afecta a la salud de las mujeres porque en este país, en España, el porcentaje de mujeres que tienen accidentes sin itinere cuando van al trabajo y salen al centro de trabajo es el doble en el caso de las mujeres que en el caso de los hombres. Y por otro lado, tenemos muchos más riesgos psicosociales como consecuencia del estrés y del mantenimiento de la doble jornada. Por tanto, desde España proponemos y estamos proponiendo al Estado varias medidas. En primer lugar, tener una visión eficaz y efectiva del informe de la OIT, del último informe, que alude a los cuidados como un motor económico básico para el bienestar de las personas, para el cuidado de la sociedad y además para que el Estado social y democrático de derecho que ampara nuestra Constitución sea efectivo. Recordemos que la OIT ha dicho que en España podrían crearse, profesionalizar todos los cuidados, casi 1 millón de empleos. Ese es todo el trabajo que las mujeres hacemos de forma oculta y nosotras ya dijimos desde las comisiones obreras cuando empezamos a salir del COVID-19, que hemos salido de la pandemia sobre la salud, el trabajo y el esfuerzo de las mujeres. ¿Qué proponemos? Proponemos adoptar un pacto estatal por los cuidados donde tengamos una especial relevancia en el sector público. En segundo lugar, medidas para la negociación colectiva donde dejamos constancia de que ya no nos vale con las medidas de conciliación necesitamos la corresponsabilidad. Ya no nos vale con negociar las ausencias del puesto de trabajo para cuidar. Las excedencias, el permiso por cuidado de hijos, los permisos maternales, permisos por lactancia, que han recaído nuevamente en el esfuerzo y el desarrollo profesional de las mujeres. Ahora tenemos que empezar a negociar las presencias. ¿Cómo acudimos al puesto de trabajo? ¿Cómo flexibilizamos nuestros horarios? ¿Cómo tenemos permisos para poder acompañar a los menores al médico o a sus revisiones escolares? Hay que negociar cómo vamos y cuándo a trabajar sin afectar a la productividad, pero pudiéndolo compatibilizar con ese sí a la vida que defendemos desde las comisiones obreras. Educar en igualdad es clave en las escuelas, es clave llevar al diálogo social con el gobierno planes, instrumentos y herramientas, como en España se ha hecho con el denominado plan corresponsables, para que se pueda cuidar de las personas y usuarios y usuarias que lo necesitan, no solo para que las mujeres trabajemos, también para que tengamos derecho al ocio, derecho a nuestra propia formación, a nuestra cultura y para que los cuidados no solamente tengan como consecuencia que podamos ir a producir profesionalmente, sino también que podamos tener una vida digna. Y hay un dato importante. En España, también lo ha dicho la OIT, hay una brecha, un bache, un agujero importantísimo en el cuidado de 0 a 3 años. En este país el cuidado de 0 a 3 años no es obligatorio. Por otro lado, no solo es que no sea obligatorio, sino que no está dentro del sistema educativo, pertenece a los servicios sociales y aunque es verdad que hay una red cada vez más importante de guarderías públicas, también sabemos que esta red no es suficientemente grande ni da posibilidades a todas las mujeres y a todos los menores que de 0 a 3 años necesitan ser cuidados. El impacto del cuidado de los menores para las mujeres hasta que tienen 3 años supone una ruptura inquebrantable en su carrera profesional. Necesitamos además tener un mayor desarrollo y autonomía de la ley de dependencia. Necesitamos, por otro lado, regular las plataformas de los cuidados, porque como decimos, tenemos que aludir claramente a cuáles son las condiciones laborales de las personas que cuidan. Y hace pocos días, no hace semanas, España llevó hasta el Congreso de los Diputados, a propuesta del Gobierno, el dictamen para ratificar definitivamente el convenio 189 de la OIT. Es verdad que este convenio habla de las trabajadoras del hogar, pero también lo es que, en nuestra opinión, hay una confusión importante entre la cualificación profesional de quienes cuidan y el empleo del hogar. Por tanto, nos quedan varias cosas. Nos queda en España por definir el concepto jurídico profesional de la persona que cuida. Si es asistente, si es empleada, si es cuidadora. Por otro lado, nos queda efectivamente garantizar las condiciones de trabajo una vez que profesionalicemos estas tareas, para que las plataformas y las relaciones laborales que están en la periferia, en el perímetro externo del derecho del trabajo, no hundan sus garras sobre los trabajos de cuidados. Y termino diciendo que tenemos ciertos miedos. Entre otras cosas, tenemos miedos a que mujeres que hemos salido del suelo pegajoso, mujeres que hemos conseguido romper los techos de cristal, podamos externalizar el trabajo de cuidados a otras mujeres más precarias, más dependientes económicamente, y forjemos otra clase social dentro de la periferia que ya componemos las mujeres, que es otras mujeres más pobres, como decimos, situadas en otra margen económicamente más precaria. Por eso es importante que las mujeres desde el feminismo rompamos todas las brechas y externalicemos hacia los estados, hacia lo público, el cuidado de la sociedad para que no recaiga en nosotras, porque nos lastra culturalmente, nos lastra socialmente y tenemos que empezar definitivamente a negar que los cuidados solo podamos ejercerlos nosotras. Y a mí me gustaría terminar ya con una frase, con una cita de Virginia Woolf, que en la habitación habitada, cuando hablaba de la habitación, decía expresamente que las mujeres para hacer poesía tenemos que ser libres y para ser libres necesitamos comida, pero también habitación. Por tanto, necesitamos independencia y desde luego no hay nada que nos haya lastrado y hecho ser más dependientes que cuidar de la familia, cuidar de los hijos y cuidar de los y las dependientes. Nada más, muchas gracias. Encantada de estar aquí con todas vosotras y vosotros.
Thank you very much, Carolina. This was, again, a really, really wonderful phrasing at the end that you said to us. And I really, I think you really explained so clearly what the implications of this double burden of paid and unpaid care work have on women and their labor market incomes and also their health. And there are just two things I wanted to highlight from the things you said that I thought were very important. One was, again, highlighting the importance of collective bargaining, which is sort of part of your pact, your care pact, which I thought was, it's a very important element on negotiating really for the reorganization of work so that we can recognize and accommodate the fact that people have care responsibilities. And I think the other thing you also just mentioned at the end was on externalizing care and the fact that especially in the global north, especially in wealthier households, care tends to be externalized to more precarious workers, precarious women who tend to be of a migrant background. And as you said, this is a very, very important thing to bear in mind. And of course, these are just two of the many very interesting and important things that you said. But we can discuss a few more of those at the end. And now I'll move on to the next presentation, which is by myself and my colleague here at the ETUI, Paula Franklin. I'll just introduce Paula since I already introduced myself. Paula is a senior researcher here at the ETUI whose work explores the intersections of employment and working conditions, health and gender. And Paula's current research focuses on work-related psychosocial risks and occupational safety and health in the health and care sector. And she's also a member of the Eurofound Advisory Committee for Working Conditions and Sustainable Work and acts also as an independent expert for the WHO on health equity and the European Commission on gender and health. And I'm very pleased to be able to present together with Paula some of the research we have recently been working on here at the ETUI as part of an ETUI project on the future of remote work. And this research explores the opportunities and challenges that telework presents to gender equality, including when it comes to unpaid care work. And so I will just start by some words of introduction. I just need to find my clicker. There it is, it's here. So how does this topic on home-based telework? So let's start again. Unlike the other two presentations, our presentation will sort of focus on one specific issue, which has been much talked about during the pandemic and now in the aftermath, and that is on telework and in particular home-based telework, which is this possibility to work from home. It's not a new possibility, and it has until now offered one way for those with caring responsibilities, as we've discussed, who are predominantly women, to combine paid work with unpaid domestic work. And indeed, the majority of home-based teleworkers are women. And as I mentioned in the introduction, the pandemic has prompted employers to make home-based telework more widely available. And there are currently many ongoing debates on the desirability of telework and some of the opportunities and risks that it presents, including its implications on people with care responsibilities. And this is what we want to focus on today. So we want to look at these opportunities and risks from a particular lens by taking as a starting point of our analysis the societal ideas about the division between the public sphere of the workplace and the private sphere of the home, which are perceptions which underpin women's structural disadvantage when it comes to both paid and unpaid care work, and we'll explain that in a minute. So basically we want to situate this discussion within the broader feminist discourse on structural gender inequality, social reproduction, and unpaid domestic labor. This is going to be hard. Well, no? Oh, the big one, okay. No. Okay, okay, so where was I? So we would first like to explain this, the origins of societal ideas about the public and the private sphere and how these are related to gender inequalities, and then to explain how this is relevant to home-based telework and to outline some of the challenges and opportunities of such arrangements for women. And then we would like to finish by highlighting some of the solutions that we need to be thinking about to ensure that home-based telework has an overall positive effect for those with care responsibilities. And I will pass to Paula now. Hope maybe there.
Okay, you can click.
I can
more.
click, yes,
Okay.
to talk about the first point.
Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to see you here. Welcome everyone online as well. And thank you to the previous speakers for making such an excellent case, already laying the grounds for what we are presenting on relating to telework today. But to start, let's say, if not from the beginning, but a few hundred years back, the division of social space into private sphere of home and the public domain, as we know it, is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution, with many consequences for gender inequality. One of the central has been the division of labor, in which home is for the unpaid, invisible, undervalued work of women, while the public world is for work with remuneration and traditionally conducted by the so-called male breadwinner. Now, you might think that this kind of division sounds a bit dated, and as with any social phenomenon, of course, it's not so clear-cut. However, as an ideology, as a thinking pattern, it does continue to exert very normative power through our social practices and also through legislation. So what we are saying here with Kalina, we are exploring these ideas, we're doing the research, it's an ongoing work, but we're saying that the historical origins and the consequences of the division of space into public and private continues to impact gender relations and disadvantage women. For example, while women's labor market participation has steadily risen over the last century, employment rates of women are still lower than those for men in all EU member states. And we also heard about how women spend considerably more time than men in care and household work. Women's participation in public life, such as politics, also remains unequal to men's participation. So this is something that we can start to see where we are going with this conceptualization. Now, the public sphere has received considerable attention in terms of research and the politics around gender inequalities and eliminating the inequalities. But the thinking around the home, the private space, as a place of work, and particularly as the office in terms of telework, remains very incomplete. To be honest, it's insufficient. And while you could think that the division, let's say, you might think that it used to protect your private life, so you would go to work at the workplace, close the door behind you, and switch to your private sphere where the employer cannot interfere. Such thinking has been challenged by the blurred boundaries in home-based telework. So what we see here is particularly important is that the public-private divide has defined the reach of labor law and makes also the legislation in terms of occupational health and safety very, very challenging. So the work performed in the home has traditionally either been excluded from labor protection altogether, or it has accorded a lower level of protection. And as in the case of paid and unpaid domestic work, the fact that the private space of home is not considered to be a site of production and labor has contributed to the undervaluation of this type of work and the struggle for the recognition of home-based workers as real workers. And the vast majority, as we heard, of these workers, they are women. So why is it that we are bringing the historical division of social space into public and private to the discussion about the future of work? Surely we are looking forward rather than backward. Now, what we see is that the spatial division, the ideological structure, has become translated into unequal social relations that have impacts on the new remote practices as well. Yes, you clicked already.
Sorry,
Okay.
a bit in advance.
So exactly,
Sorry
I
about
was just about to say, let's move like kind of fast forward from the Industrial Revolution factories to the spring 2020, as we have here, and the COVID-19 crisis prompted telework that brought the numerous challenges of home-based workers to the forefront and has initiated a large shift to more permanent home-based telework. So now that the office, the workplace is increasingly located in the private space of home, the influence of the binary logic of the public space and the private space is becoming evident as we said, the remit of employment and occupational safety and health legislation has to balance on this line. And unpaid care work is a key aspect of this situation. Because as Kalina mentioned, for women, research shows that working from home has often been the only feasible way to combine unpaid work such as childcare with paid employment. And in occasions there's been, or employers might have allowed women to work from home, and then they had to endure worse terms and conditions, less autonomy and poor working environment. Now, the work-family conflict continues to be more prominent for women. Here you can see you have a few indicators. There's a blue and green data bar. Women are here marked with blue and men with green. And what it tells is the different indicators about work-life conflict when doing telework at home during the pandemic. And you can see that in all of the indicators, women are definitely being more impacted by work-life conflict. Also, while women continue to work more often part-time, they still suffer more from time poverty when you count the paid and unpaid working hours. So women do work a lot, and a lot of this work happens in the private sphere of home. Now, this matters, of course, to gender equality, but also because the evidence is solid on the negative health impacts, as we heard from previous speaker. The poor work-life balance can result in many physical and mental health problems. And while this poor work-life balance can impact all workers, research shows that these negative consequences of work-life conflict appear stronger in women exactly due to the gendered care role. For example, there's a relationship between poor work-life balance and poorer self-reported health among working women, and women tend to experience higher forms of stress due to poor work-life balance than men. Now, as work-life balance relates to how work is organized, the health impacts are not a matter of a sensitivity or the resilience of the individual workers, but these are consequences of the poor organization of work tasks and processes. And these are often, it is often also the case that the processes and the tasks are planned without the involvement of the workers. So when you think of your new teleworking practices, were you consulted? Did you have an input? And this is very important also to bring out the gender differences in the home-based telework. Now, final thought is that before the pandemic, more women than men in the EU were doing home-based telework, and more women than men in the EU are working in jobs that could lend themselves to teleworking. So therefore, it's really important to analyze the ways in which the gendered ideology regarding the public and private space is produced in order to avoid the recreating and reinforcing the gender inequalities. So perhaps the situation can even open up some new opportunities to correct the structural gender inequalities. And I'll move over to Kalina to discuss the positives.
Thank you very much, Paula. Okay, there we go. I actually just wanted to start by picking up on something that you said a few minutes ago, just to stress it, because I think this is sort of a very important part of the solutions that we'll be proposing. And this is that the influence of the public-private divide on the boundaries of legal protection. So Paula mentioned law has been slow to intervene in the private sphere of the home, and this has had negative repercussions for women. A very good example is the traditional reluctance of the state to intervene in cases of domestic violence and to criminalize it to protect women, but also unpaid care work remains entirely outside the scope of labor law, which is in some ways understandable, but it also in other ways, it sort of reinforces this perception that only work performed in the public sphere is work, and the fact that domestic workers and home-based workers are subject to lower protection or no protection at all, that they remain invisible and isolated and often not subject to excluded from labor inspections and so on, again shows how these sort of social divisions of space which are gendered are reflected in law, which in turn perpetuates disadvantages and vulnerabilities affecting women in particular. And so this is a point that I want to stress again and to come back to. But now turning to the sort of home-based telework in particular, the gender division of space is highly relevant also in this case, which is a particular type of home-based telework which can be performed at home remotely, even though it could technically most of the time be performed in the office as well. And it can offer possibilities for a better work-life balance because it offers greater possibilities to arrange work according to care tasks in the home or to reduce commuting times. And we know that women are taking advantage of this, and Paul already said this. Women constitute a greater share of home-based teleworkers, and it is very likely that they're also a higher share of jobs typically performed by women offer possibilities to telework. And so with the increasing availability of telework after the pandemic, this means that more women are likely to switch to this mode of working, which may have the positive effect of higher women's participation in the labor market. And at least in theory, it could also lead to a more equal distribution of unpaid care work as well, because it also becomes more acceptable for men to work from home and to better combine work and private life. But again, the location of this work in the private space of the home subjects workers to certain disadvantages. So home-based teleworkers, and in particular, if they are only or primarily based at home, may be less visible in the workplace and perceived to be less committed to their job and overlooked for promotion and for certain other career opportunities. And this is in part connected to the perception that work performed in the private space is not real work. And home-based teleworkers may also, without specific efforts to make this possible for them, benefit less from formal and particularly informal learning opportunities. And they may also feel socially isolated and have reduced access to information on rights, but also in participation in workplace decision-making and workplace organization, as Paula already talked about. And as is the case of other home and domestic workers, the lack of occupational health and safety precautions, regulations, but also inspections in the private home of the worker is a big issue, particularly because these workers are more exposed to certain health risks, some of which Paula has already mentioned. And in particular, telework is associated, as I'm sure many of you will have experienced, with the intensification of work, increased availability, and in fact longer working hours, which may put particular pressure on those who perform the bulk of unpaid care work. On top of that, and as Paula already mentioned, you can see this in the data from the pandemic, that women experienced more sharper work-life balance conflicts. And in fact, I think it's also worth mentioning that studies show that especially home-based teleworkers with children are more likely to work in what is usually supposed to be their free time. And again, this may be something that some of you have experienced as well. And so all of this can lead to increased psychosocial risks. For example, there is evidence suggesting that teleworkers in general experience more anxiety at work and other health effects. And one thing that I should also mention is that telework hides possibilities for increased online harassment, including sexual harassment. And I think there is also another concern, which I think is really, really important to highlight here, because we have had this, I wouldn't call it rhetoric, but we have heard a lot about the advantages of home-based telework, about combining work and care and so on, and empowering women. But there is the concern, which is that if more women than men take up opportunities to work from home, this might in fact entrench associations of the home space with women and gender stereotypes regarding care responsibilities, and perhaps even mean that women who decide to start working from home take up more care work as well. And I think it's worth mentioning as well, again, in light of the experience of the pandemic, that it might also expose all workers to an increased risk of domestic violence, particularly when telework is not voluntary and workers do not have the chance to go to the employer's premises. So bottom line here is that home-based telework hides some serious risks for women, serious risk for workers, for all workers, which disproportionately affect women. But we talked about that it can have positive effects, and it can have positive transformative effects. And what can we do in terms of policies to sort of increase the positive opportunities and reduce the challenges and risks? And what Paul and I think here is a real opportunity is the fact that as more people, both men, people of all genders, switch to this mode of working, assumptions about the public-private divide, so that work performed in the home is not real work, or in some way subordinate to work performed in the public domain, will need to be reconsidered. I think it is more evident than ever that work performed in the home is just as valuable as that performed in the workplace, and that the implications of this public-private divide, including the way in which it limits labor protection, are unsustainable. And so challenging this assumption, and this is our argument, really needs to be the starting point when designing regulations and policies related to home-based telework. And the other point I want to make is that debates on protecting home-based teleworkers, which are very prominent now, can be more than just about that. They can also be an opportunity to advocate for better protection of home-based workers and domestic workers, to increase the visibility of unpaid care work, and to shine a light on the way in which all work performed in the home, primarily by women, has been devalued. And so how do we get there? What are the policies that we need to put in place? My next slide. The next challenge is the next slide. There we go. It's the last one, I promise. So I think maybe the first key thing to mention is that our approach to regulating home-based telework, and what we'll say now, I think it needs to be situated within the general measures on care and unpaid care work that Barbara and Carolina talked about. So this is just one aspect of the story, it's one piece of the puzzle. And so what we need to do is develop a gender-sensitive approach to regulating telework, and this entails gender mainstreaming when it comes to workplace practices, policies, collective agreements, and legislative interventions as well. And research shows that appropriate work organization, again, Paula mentioned this, autonomy and trust between employer and employer are essential for workers to be able to enjoy the benefits of home-based telework. The participation of workers in decision-making and worker organization is key, as well as gender-sensitive collective agreements, and the proper implementation of framework agreements, such as the 2002 Framework Agreement on Telework between the European social partners. We need legal rights, such as the right to disconnect, the right to request telework, and to flexible working hours. And these latter two are sort of already possible to some extent under the Work-Life Balance Directive. And there has been much discussion of the right to disconnect at national, but also now European level. But legal rights are by themselves not enough, not just because they don't prevent, for example, the additional workload given by the employer, but because they're often poorly enforced. And so there also needs to be an obligation on employers to prevent risks to mental and physical well-being. And I think at this point, I will pass on to Paula for a few finishing last remarks on this.
Thank you, Kalina, and thank you for talking through so well and clearly what for me has been kind of like ideas and brainstorming, but you put it together really well. So in terms of the policy measures, just perhaps one point I would see that, as we heard from the opening speech from Nicola Contouris, that it's not just one solution. We need a combination of solutions, of different measures, so we should not kind of hop on a one-trick pony here. And we need to, when thinking of home-based telework specifically, we definitely need to look into the occupational health and safety regulations and the current limitations. We, for example, know from the data that psychosocial risks are rife in home-based telework, and the right to disconnect is one tool, and it's an important tool, but it's not enough alone, for example, to address workload issues or work-life conflict issues. So this is just a message there. And in addition to occupational safety and health, we need to look into employment conditions in relation to working conditions, because there could be a risk for more precarious employment for the home-based telework. There is actually some research emerging that is looking into this home-based telework that used to be more of the higher earners, certain high educated occupations, which is now changing into more of these, let's say, platformization, click and gig work. And there is an increased number of women who are doing that work at home. So really to keep an eye on that. And then just we are still in the research side of the conference. So a couple of research themes that pop into mind related to the nexus of the gender, occupational safety and health and online work. So really look at, I think the harassment there is clearly an issue, as well as just to really think of the reconceptualization of home as a workplace. And in relation to this, we need to closely follow up and monitor the workplace practices. So if in-person meetings or these real life conferences, the kind of the public space of office continues to be considered as superior to home-based work, or the home office, then who is participating in the meetings, who is invited to the events, and are home-based workers then disadvantaged, and who are the home-based workers? Like the data shows that it's likely to be women. So if there is a lack of trust towards home-based teleworkers, are they exposed to digital surveillance while they are working at home? So there are lots of different issues that we do need to monitor, and specifically how the different practices either enable or hinder gender equality. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula, and thank you all for bearing with me with the with the clicking thing. I think this is the end of it. So I think I will jump straight to our discussant, Paola Panzeri, who is the policy advisor on gender equality, local and regional government at the European Public Service Union EPSU, and currently the vice president of the E2C Women's Committee. Before this, Paola was a policy and advocacy manager of COFES, Families Europe, which is a network of civil society associations representing the interests of all families, where she led the work in support of the Work-Life Balance Directive. And Paola has been working on EU employment and gender equality policies in Brussels for over a decade now. And before this, she worked for human rights NGOs and institutions. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Paola's comments and questions and reflections on these topics in the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kalina, and thank you for inviting me here today. I have the role of trying to find the points where we don't necessarily all agree and trying to put my finger in there, which is very difficult because I think in this room we share very much most of what we say. I think I would start off by just wishing you all a happy public service day tomorrow. Tomorrow is the 23rd of June, which is the International Day for Public Services. And we heard quite a bit today. I think if I have to summarize the keywords, some of the keywords that were mentioned by all our speakers, as indeed public measures, public investment, public services. Also, the working conditions came out quite strongly as one of the key issues, structural inequalities, privatization, and again, as opposed to public investment in public services, gender pay gap, collective bargaining, quite a few things. But I wanted to make a couple of comments first and then try to bring in some provocation, if I manage. Couple of things I wanted to say is indeed also a couple of examples. We had a discussion within EPSU about care. And I think one of the issues I'd like to point out is the fact care is a right and not a commodity. Care is something that everybody should be entitled to respond to their basic human rights to life and dignity, UNCRPD conventions on the rights of persons with disabilities, UNCRC convention on the rights of the child. Care is a right. Care is a right that must be provided to everyone according to their needs, the needs of care and support. We cannot just trade and we cannot just benefit from care services because they're there, because we're lucky enough to be born in a good place, which is where services are provided, because we're rich enough that we can afford them, because we have inherited the possibility to have that. Care should be for everyone, regardless of where you live, regardless of where you are. The fact is that now this is not the case. This is not the case. We've been clapping at frontline workers. We've been clapping at hospital workers, health workers, long-term care services workers for years. There's still not more stuff. They're still not better paid. Their working conditions are still very hard. Just to make an example, I was talking with a care worker from long-term care facility, a residential long-term care facility in Belgium. And she was saying during the pandemic, we had some rooms that were isolated for COVID positive patients. We have tools to help us lifting the persons that would need help in standing up. We couldn't move the machines from a positive ward to a ward where there was no COVID positive patients. I was the machine. I was carrying these people up. It was my back. It was my legs. Have I been paid for it? Have I been compensated for it? Is that taken into account in the fact that the way I'm aging, the way I'm actually working every day? No, it's not. You talk to childcare workers that will tell you, have you ever been in a room with 20 kids of 2 years old all day, every day, 5 days a week? Because they're noisy. Is their fault? No, but they are noisy. So there are comparisons. They're actually starting comparing the decibel. How much are you impacted, or how much your hearing is, how much of decibel there are in your workplace when you work on a road, making road works, and how much is it in a childcare? Not very different. So are those compensating? Coming back to your industrial revolutions, we set standards, and I'm here as a unionist, and I'm proud we set standards to compensate the hard work, the pénibilité, the hardest part of the work, the noise, the heavy lifting. I'm proud with it that we do need to do it for women's jobs as well, or for those sectors that are still women dominated. Because there is the hard work, the hard lifting, the noise. We don't compensate. Look at the possibility of careers you have if you work in a childcare. You work in a childcare, you're a childcare manager. Maybe there is a third childcare assistant. That's it. How much can you grow? How much your salary can grow? We need to stop under evaluating those jobs, because they're constantly under evaluating. Like, if I'm a woman, it's in my nature to do these jobs. No, it's a career choice. It's self-determination. Are we allowing women to self-determine if we really put them, we decide as a society that that's a woman's job? Not really. So we really need to reevaluate care work in their paid form. And only if we really evaluate and we allow also for women not to drop out of the labor market. We're talking about who drops out of the labor market if you have a person in need of care and support. A partner, a child with disabilities, an adult with disability, an older parent or relative, the one who earns less. Who is the one who earns the less? The woman. Is it a biased choice? No, I would do the same. I would do the same if in my family I was the one where the family would suffer the less, and if I would stay home. The point is, we need to pay those women better, because the work they do is highly qualified, and we don't pay them what they deserve. But we do, however, need to change this. And when we talk about, for example, working condition in externalized services, an example from the UK. There has been in the social care, a lot in the UK, as you might probably well know, a lot has been outsourced from local governments. The largest 13 providers in England, if you do, there's been a research done by Unison, the UK union. Out of £100 that was given as a public contract to these providers, £19.30, so almost 20%, was used to pay out shareholders. So almost 20% that what was paid out of public money in an externalized service did not go to the service, did not go to the users, did not go to the workers. It went to shareholders. And that's why I think it's incredibly important that now we take a stand and we say no to profit on care, no to commercialization on care. Care is not a commodity. Care is a right. And I think we really have to sometimes be firm on those fundamentals. Another thing I wanted, and please stop me when I'm done with my time because I could go on for a long time. We're talking about breaking the circle of care from women to women that is in more precarious condition. We need to raise the floor. We need to raise for everyone so that there is no, by definition, precarious working condition for women's jobs. We really need to bring back, as Carolina said, bring care work is a public matter. Is not a private matter, is a public matter. We do need collective bargaining, as you said. We have a few things on the table. You mentioned the work-life balance directive. We have a work-life balance directive. Is it the best directive ever? No. Is it a good tool? Yes. What is the point now? It has to be transposed and implemented. It's not enough to have more and more and more and more instruments. It's not enough to build new policy. We have to make sure that we sit there every day, making sure that that policy is implemented in every single country, in every single workplace. And I'll close on the last 2 points. Really, I could go on for hours. Another, you mentioned the Telework agreement in 2002. Now the social partners have decided to renegotiate Telework and right to disconnect. In the mandate of the ETUC, there is addressing the gender dimension of Telework. It is something which is there. We have to make sure it stays there and it's present, it's mainstreamed. Otherwise, we end up doing a thing by men for men. And that's why also as Women Committee, we're pushing for this to be very present. I won't say anything on Telework because actually you said it all. It's not a coping strategy. It's really like we need to make sure that women are not excluded and segregated by on the labor market. And here, I would like probably to ask a couple of provocative questions. I was asked to look for questions, so I had to look. So I'm pushing it a bit, but the question of some before that, something that was not really mentioned is pension gap.
There we have a question on this.
Pension gap. If we drop out of the same me that drops out of the labor market, if I drop out when I'm old enough to earn a good, decent salary, and who hires me? Who hires me back after 5 or 10 years I've been out of the labor market? Who hires me back with a good salary and decent working condition? And then are we telling generations of women, me included, that we will live in poverty in our old age because we don't put the services that are needed together? Where is the public investment? We need investment in services. Why are women dropping out of the labor market? Most of it also because there is no services to fulfill their needs. Are all these carers that are not paid carers caring at home, would they be happier if they could have some more services for their persons in need, family members in need of care and support? Yes, they would. At least that was the last survey that the NGOs were running on the topic. So my last point would be just while, yes, let's consider, you mentioned considering home as a workplace. However, my question would be, and also because I think research and workers representative, we should really work together. We should really make our voices stronger together. And one thing when you mentioned that clicked in my head was how, however, we make sure that we keep the ties and the links with those workers. How do we make sure we're not fragmenting? We're not saying, okay, let's fragment the workplace and the collective power that would change the balance of power of employers and workers. If I'm at home alone, how would I face something that my employer would tell me? How would I have the chance to talk with my colleague, to talk with my union rep? It was in an informal way, in a corridor, when, just reading a poster that is in, or a leaflet that is left into the kitchen. That happens at workplaces when there is a workplace. How can I not make sure that this atomization of workplaces where everybody works in different places doesn't translate into something being against the balance of power for workers, and actually we're making it more harder for workers to stand for their own rights, because that would be an individual stand up compared to a collective stand up. And the other last thing, we talk about a lot about the right to disconnect, and I think it's a very good thing. Let's get the second question, polemic. Do we have the working time? Why do we have to disconnect if we already have the working time? We know when we work. When we don't work, we don't work. Isn't it? Shouldn't it be straightforward? Like, why do we need an extra right when we say that we're not working? So how do we combine those things, and we don't reinvent the wheel, but again we stick strong on our fundamentals once again. So those were the questions I could find, and I hope that I brought some elements. Again, we could really talk much more about all of these things. Just checking if I forgot something I wanted to tell you, but no, I think this is it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. So first of all, I really thank you a lot for really bringing in this sort of strong public services perspective, because of course all of us mentioned it, but this is really your domain, and thank you also for mentioning these really real experiences of workers during the pandemic, but not only. And I think what's kind of happened quite nicely, I think, through all of the discussions, is that we've really brought together the question of unpaid care work with the question of paid care work. And I think really shown how all of these issues between paid and unpaid care workers and gender equality, and also gender pay gaps and gaps in pensions, they are all interconnected. And I think that's really, really important to bear in mind, also in terms of our strategy of addressing gender equality. It needs to be a holistic approach that looks at all of these dimensions. So I think they sort of came together quite nicely. Perhaps maybe I can start by addressing the questions that you just raised. I think you really put your finger on the point about workplace organization and about workers' participation. How do we reach out to these workers who now work from home? And I think this is going to be a big challenge for trade unions. I think it's already a challenge to organize domestic workers. I mean, really long-standing challenge in organizing domestic and home workers. Basically, it's on the whole very weak. I think there's also a similar challenge when it comes to platform workers. And I think trade unions have been developing new approaches, and I think there really is a lot of scope there for technology in the way that it's enabling us to work from home. Can it also enable us to organize whilst we are at home? But one thing I actually want to mention in my presentation is that actually I think maybe we do need to put this question: is home-based telework, when you only work from home all the time, is this actually a good thing, or should we be looking for some kind of more balanced approach? And the research to date, there is good Eurofund research pre-pandemic, which suggests that actually the best outcomes in terms of employee well-being are when home-based telework is only occasional. So it's not, it's not 5 days a week, it's not 4 days a week, it's maybe 3 days a week, 2 days, some sort of alternating structure like this, which means that then you actually know your colleagues, there's linkages to your colleagues and so on, or there are sort of in-person meetings and social events and so on, which already, I think, try to address some of this marginalization. But I think you're absolutely correct to ask this question. And so it needs to be a question about work organization and also trade union and workers' rep strategies as well. And I think that the question on the right to disconnect and working time, I mean, it's a good question, but I think here we have to remember that the working time directive incorporates an opt-out. And so, people can sign an opt-out of the 48-hour working week, and they can work 60 hours if they want. And in which case, perhaps if your boss is calling you on a Sunday, maybe a right to disconnect will be useful. But I think basically you're right to say, well, actually, should we not be revising the working time regulation in the first place? And I think there's many reasons to revise working time regulation. Health and safety is one of them. Gender equality is another one. I think Barbara also mentioned this as well. And so I think this is a very good question. And I think the point that I tried to make with both of these rights is that a right is worth nothing if you don't know about it and if you can't enforce it. And so I think, again, we need to think about rights, but also obligations on employers. And so I don't know, Paula, if you want to mention something more on the telework questions, or I think there's some more questions and I can...
I think...
Just to say, I'm not suggesting we should necessarily revise the working time directive. I'm just saying we have a right in place. We should build on that and not just start as a scratch as if we didn't have a right in the first place. Revising a directive also implies that having a political environment that will allow you to have a better result at the end. I'm not sure if we will have a better result at the end if we'll open the working time directive now. So the question is also, how do we build on it and not we just those things separate, and we don't create a working time different for teleworkers, that it's a different working time for what we already have. That's important. Like teleworkers are workers.
I guess I could add, I'm thinking, kind of thinking out loud here, that there's perhaps a rush to create new practices and policies to respond to the situation that we were thrown into in terms of telework, the COVID pandemic, the frontline workers, and then just kind of going back to a drawing board and thinking that if we're placing new policies into the old structures, public-private divide, not valuated care work, these issues, you know, where do we get with it? So therefore, I think like that's what we're kind of looking at. Okay, you know, out from the box. You know, this is what we've been saying for a long time already, but we can still see that these ghosts or the structures, the inequalities are following us. So that's one. And now I think this is turning into a physics panel because, you know, in addition to talking about space, we are talking about time. So we have space and time continuum here in terms of women's work. But there is, we actually looked at with the colleagues at the ETUI very recently, a couple of months ago, the data about the working time quality. So because this is something that has been discussed in terms of, okay, long working hours very harmful for your work, so 55 plus hours per week, and we obviously see in the data that majority of the workers who work this long, they are men. So then we looked at that, okay, so what's working time actually? So do you have autonomy over when you can work? You know, do you have work-life conflicts? And then we can start seeing that the conflicts actually happen to women. So just to again go back to the, like when we talk about, you know, concepts like, you know, working time or, you know, where you work, your workplace, let's look at the gender, take the gender perspective. Let's just really look at like who is impacted and in which way. And this is what I would as a researcher encourage doing in terms of when formulating policies, thinking of any revisions for legislation. So just to really do there and to remember that workers are the ones who know their working conditions. They're the experts of their working conditions. So you do need to engage with them. So that's it.
Thank you. I just want to bring Barbara and Carolina back in for a couple of questions. I think if they're still there, I can't see them, but I hope they're still there. So there's sort of two questions. One question is the one that's in the chat, which is I think something that we already touched on. So the existing inequality between gender leads in the intergender pension gap of about 30%. And what are your thoughts on the pension gap? And I think Barbara has already indicated that she would like to answer this. So there's a question perhaps also for both of you. And I have a question, I think for all of the speakers, because I know all of you are involved in this in some ways, which is, what are your ambitions for the upcoming European care strategy, which is developed? So what are your ambitions, and perhaps what can we realistically expect from it? So these are the two questions. I think because we started a bit late, we have maybe about 5 more minutes just to hear from you again, and any other questions or concluding remarks that you might have. So Barbara, I'll start with you.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Super.
Yes.
I'm very grateful for the question, because that the issue of pension and inequalities in pension systems, it has been haunting me for the last 20 years. It used to be an issue that nobody really paid attention to. Neither the trade unions paid attention to it, the gender aspect of pension systems, nor the women's movement. And it was really sort of an underdog in the sense. But when we talk about pensions, it's real money. And what we found out when we first discussed a directive on access to goods and services, we found out, for example, that private pension systems would automatically discriminate women because they tend to live longer. Or in 2005, women were still charged a higher rate of health insurances because they had the risk of having babies. So, I mean, the whole issue of insurances and pension has a tremendous impact on gender equality, because the way the systems are designed, they're designed according to white working men and not to women's different biographies. And I've seen the statistics here. 30% on average is the difference between men and women in terms of accessing the amount of pensions. In some countries, it's 50%. So no wonder you have a feminization of poverty. And unless the systems take account of, for example, unpaid work, we won't have gender equality in pensions. So thank you very much for the question. It should be something that we should all be concerned about, and particularly collective bargaining should take account of the differences in pensions that men and women receive.
Thank you very much. Carolina, would you like to add something on pensions or on the care strategy of the EU?
Sí, muy esquemáticamente decir, yo quería poner el énfasis en todo lo que tiene que ver con las pensiones en la cotización. Ningún sistema público o privado, pero en España público expresamente, de pensiones va a tener consecuencias y objetivos que no estén atravesados por una brecha de género si no hacemos mención a la cotización. Y para eludir esa brecha de género en la cotización tenemos que aludir a las condiciones de trabajo a lo largo de toda la vida laboral. No tiene ningún sentido que pongamos propuestas, índices cuantitativos que palíen las brechas de género a la hora de calcular una pensión si no atacamos el origen, que son cotizaciones más cortas, más precarias, cotizaciones más bajas porque tienen salarios más bajos a lo largo de toda la carrera laboral, y luego carreras laborales atravesadas por la desigualdad que provocan los cuidados, ¿no? Por tanto, en España, como bien conocen ustedes, hace pocos meses hemos cerrado con el Gobierno una modificación de la reforma de la legislación laboral que está generando cientos y cientos de contratos indefinidos en mujeres, donde efectivamente lo principal es que tengan estabilidad laboral, y lo principal a partir de aquí es que tengamos buenos índices de sindicación, pero desde luego lo principal es que con buena intervención del diálogo social tengamos salarios efectivamente justos para ellas y que provoquen al final de su relación laboral pensiones muchas más justas. A relaciones laborales no atravesadas efectivamente por la brecha de género tendremos igualmente pensiones que no estén atravesadas por la misma. Y cuanto al asunto de cuidados, creemos que esto es un asunto que tiene que ver efectivamente con una estrategia europea, no nos cabe ninguna duda, y esa estrategia europea tiene que pasar efectivamente porque los cuidados formen parte de la agenda prioritaria de los gobiernos, que haya un pacto de Estado a todos los niveles, estableciendo políticas públicas y desde luego haciendo una tarea importante desde el sindicalismo de clase de sensibilización, advirtiendo de que cuidar no es solamente cuidar y para que las mujeres podamos trabajar y podemos tener carreras profesionales, sino también para que podamos desenvolvernos personalmente trabajando o no trabajando. Por tanto, requerimos, y lo que vamos a proponer a esa estrategia europea de cuidados es esto, un pacto europeo desde lo público.
Thank you very much. Actually, before I sort of give the final word to people in the room here, are there any questions from the floor? Yes.
Very briefly, can you hear me?
Yes. I think my colleague will, yes. Will be there with the microphone so that the participants online can hear you as well.
No.
I can, if you want, just say, and I can, or
Okay, I can check your microphone.
thank you.
for the online.
Okay, thank you very much, anyway, for a very interesting session. I really like the way you went from the sort of big picture to sort of telework, which is a very important question. My 2-3 questions are, number one, Barbara mentioned the fact that we must move away, and you really agreed, Kalina, we must move away from a GDP growth driven. How do we do it? I mean, there's not so many people in the room. I hope in the other rooms they're talking about that sort of thing as well. But I mean, this is, I think, a very, very crucial point that we should address. My second question was for Carolina. How did the Court of Justice recent judgment on the payment of domestic workers, I mean, how was it sort of taken? I understood that you had a recent sort of legislation in Spain. Was that taken up in this legislation in Spain? And how do we sort of make more of this Court of Justice judgment? And the third one is for this study on telework, which I think is very crucial. Do you have already sort of endorsed the Eurostat, maybe sort of collects figures on who is doing telework? I mean, men and is it disaggregated by sex? Because, I mean, in many professions as well, telework can be seen as a disadvantage and sometimes as an advantage as well. There's a lot of professions where telework is just not possible at all. It's not a choice. So, I mean, telework can be a right, it can be an advantage. So that's my questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming up here. So I think I will start with the more sort of specific question, which was for Carolina, which was on the ECJ judgment. And then I will jump to Barbara, perhaps also to address the point about moving away from GDP. And then for any final remarks from the floor here. We only have a few minutes, so if we can be brief, that would be great. Also, so the interpreters and our staff here can take a break.
Bueno, en principio es verdad que se ha condenado a España por discriminación indirecta porque las empleadas del hogar no cobran el desempleo. El impacto va a ser rotundo porque tenemos que modificar toda la legislación laboral. En España es una relación laboral especial, no tienen derecho al desempleo, no existe para ellas el despido, sino una figura que se llama desistimiento y tiene que modificarse todo tanto que tenemos que incorporar su relación laboral al Estatuto de los Trabajadores. Por tanto, lo que queda es sentarnos en el diálogo social y abrir efectivamente unas mesas en las que los sindicatos más representativos y el gobierno introduzcamos en todos los aspectos, desde la cotización, las prestaciones de seguridad social y las propias condiciones de trabajo, empezar a regularlas. Y, por tanto, cuando llegue efectivamente, definitivamente la ratificación, habrá un impacto claro en las relaciones laborales de estas mujeres. Y termino, si me permites que introduzca un pequeño matiz sobre la pregunta que hacía la compañera sobre el teletrabajo. En nuestra opinión, el denominado en España trabajo a distancia, que no es solo teletrabajo, no es para nosotras una medida de conciliación. Es una medida de organización del trabajo, que tiene que ser, en nuestra opinión, pactado con las patronales, pactado con las empresas. ¿Puede ser un derecho? Puede serlo, pero ojo a la trampa. El teletrabajo, el trabajo a distancia puede devolver a las mujeres a trabajar a sus casas. En nuestra opinión es una medida de organización, no una medida de conciliación corresponsable entre la vida laboral y familiar.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Barbara, do you have any final points, perhaps on the move away from GDP? I mean, I actually have a very short point to make on that. I think, how do we do it? I think it's a really good question, and I think one that we at the ETUI are certainly very, very concerned and very interested in. So we will be organizing a conference in December on to discuss these questions on moving beyond growth as a sort of prequel of a bigger conference organized by the political parties in May of next year. And so I hope this will be sort of a movement to discuss how we can do this. But Barbara, to you. You're muted.
I mean, it's a very challenging question to at the end of this panel, but definitely, I mean, we've been always talking about a new care deal, and we've talked about this being more holistic, and not even the Nordic countries have this kind of holistic approach. So in terms of Europe, we need to set a new framework, and not only specific policy objectives on care, but also it needs to be reinforced by social care objectives within the current governance framework. For example, in the context of a revised semester and a social scoreboard. So that's the approach that needs to be taken. On a more general level, we're really talking about care versus competition, and that would really be a paradigmatic shift in terms of social cohesion and the social framework. And that's all I can say at this particular point in time, but it would be well worth further research and many conferences. Thank you.
And thank you very much. I think I'm terribly out of time here, but if the two of you would like to say any final words, and we can maybe conclude.
I can pick up on the question on the do we have any numbers, figures, data? So we actually do have. So I think there was a report by the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, for example, looking at the teleworkable jobs and estimating what kind of jobs could be that. And I think the key there would be that it's a choice. So the telework and how much you telework should be a choice. And again, we go back to the consulting the workers, asking about their working conditions. For some would prefer more teleworking days, and some would have fewer. And of course, the gender aspect there is that some of the recent research shows that there are different motivations for men and women to telework. And for women, it was for better work-life balance, and for men, it was for working longer hours. So this tells it all. The old structures, let's move forward.
Maybe just a quick sentence on your question on what we want from the care strategy. I can tell you what we want is a strategy that fulfill the needs on the ground. That means more investment in public services. That means more investment in the workers, better working conditions, more workers, addressing the staff shortages. Lots of the staff, a lot of turnover. Someone mentioned 70% of healthcare sector being women. Social services, we go up, average 85. Guess where the 15% of men are working as managers. So we need to address, to also enable the people to stay in the sector by offering quality, decent jobs. And also quality jobs also means quality provision of services, because what we want at the end is quality care services. And final, we want this care strategy not to be an excuse to privatize again even more the care sector. What we want is more investment in the public service and not an excuse to make profit on care. Because as we see, profit it goes into the pockets of the shareholder, doesn't go into the worker, doesn't go into the service, doesn't go into the users, and doesn't go to anybody that needs, and doesn't go into society. So no to commercialization of care. That would be my bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. I think this is a good sort of message to end on. Thank you very much to our speakers, to our audience, to the questions, also in the chat. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you today and to discuss these very important topics and exchange ideas. So on that, I will finish and enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you also to Barbara and Karina on the screen. I'm not sure if they're still there, but thank you very much.
Thank you.